So here we have the top 100 Super Nintendo games. This one ended up being pretty difficult to adapt from the original website list, as I actually made that list back in 2009. It turned out to be the oldest list on the entire website, so I ended up overhauling and rewriting the whole thing. As normal, the usual rules apply here. Only one game representing each property, unless I feel it's unavoidable. Import games are only eligible if they don't require Japanese knowledge to play, and games ported over from earlier consoles are low priority. With all that out of the way, onto the list. So every list has to start somewhere, and this one begins with the head-to-head puzzle game known as Pieces, a game with a highly original concept based around competitive jigsaw placing, which works surprisingly well, truth be told. The structure is kind of like many of the two-player block-falling puzzle games out there, in that you're always attempting to outplay an opponent and are given access to a variety of different ways to sabotage their game. In this instance you gain abilities to freeze or reverse their controls if you play well enough. A highly unique game that provides some very fun two-player matches. There's really nothing else like it out there. Equinox is a sequel to the NES cult classic Solstice. Gameplay is a mixture of puzzle solving and adventuring in an isometric environment, with you exploring the world doing puzzles based around a pseudo 3D perspective. It doesn't quite live up to its classic predecessor, but it's still a great game well worth checking out. Rock'n'Roll Racing is a weapons-based racing game of the isometric variety, released by the company that would go on to become Blizzard, known for their huge Warcraft series. The game is clearly patterned on classic titles like RC Pro-Am, with you racing around the courses firing missiles at your opponents and laying hazards down on the road and such. The music here is of special note. It's all SNES renditions of popular rock music, largely from the 70s and 80s, all brought to the system by the ever excellent Tim Follin, who was one of the most celebrated soundsmiths of retro gaming, and whom will probably be mentioned quite a few times during the course of this list due to the high pedigree of his Super Nintendo work. This dude could get some real high fidelity sound out of the SNES sound chip. All in all, Rock'n'Roll Racing is just a lot of fun, and it has an excellent multiplayer component too. The Mega Drive really built a name for itself as the sports machine early on, with the Super Nintendo lagging behind for a while, but it was with releases like Madden 94 that the Super Nintendo started to catch up, with this being the first in the series to do a decent job of competing toe-to-toe with the Mega Drive game. This one was also faster to get into than previous games in the series, and was the first to include the official names and team logos and such, due to getting the NFL license. Magical Drop 2 is a really nice Japan-only puzzle game. The game has you grabbing and firing coloured orbs to match them together. It kind of looks like Puzzle Bobble, but is quite different in implementation. Overall, it's just another nice variant on a tried and true theme. Few platformers are as open-ended and have as much faith in the player as the Addams Family. The game is very much a Mario-inspired outing, but it's tougher and drops you into a completely non-linear environment to explore with no direction, and in fact no truly right way to go either. No matter which way you head, you're bound to find something to do, whether it's defeat one of the main guardians holding a member of the family hostage, or discover the places with those all-important caches of lives and power-ups. Its open-endedness is very much reminiscent of Ocean's other respectable SNES release, Jurassic Park, but fortunately here the game provides the necessary password save that game lacked. Due to its structure, this isn't the most accessible of games, but if you take the time to fully learn its world and all of its interconnecting pathways, formulating a winning strategy, then it is one of the most rewarding ones. This is a great sequel to the classic 8-bit micro game. Sure, it could possibly win a competition for ugliest game on the console, but don't let that dissuade you. What we have here is a unique and very clever puzzle game that's like the old Atari arcade game Marble Madness if it was made into an action-adventure game. The game has you manoeuvring around the environment, solving puzzles, often involving switches, in order to collect gems. You get a speed up button and an indispensable brake button, and can even rotate the camera. It's a serious improvement over the already good original, but is very inaccessible, and I don't care how good you think you are at games, start this on beginner. It has a very steep learning curve, especially for those not accustomed to the genre. This licensed game based on a 1992 movie really does an excellent job of conveying the original Tim Burton source material, which I might add was the greatest Batman movie of them all, and I won't hear otherwise. The game is a well-crafted beat-em-up with a good variety of moves that does a great job of imparting a lot of kinetic energy and dynamism to Batman's actions. When the enemies are slammed into the ground and bashed into windows, you can really feel the impact, to the extent that you can almost feel their pain yourself. Unfortunately, the game is one player only though, which is generally a death sentence for most brawlers, but Batman Returns is saved by its variety and imagination, doing a lot more with the level design than the average beat-em-up out there. The accessible and uber-popular Basketball Classic was ported from arcade to console excellently here, with its signature emphasis on over-the-top action and pick-up-and-play fun perfectly intact. This tournament edition also added some new characters and a bunch of Easter eggs and new features to the mix. Rendering Ranger was a Japan-exclusive game made by the creator of Turrican, Manfred Trenz, and Manfred's reputation as an expert coder is very much on display here, as the game has to stand as one of, if not the most impressively programmed games on the entire system. The game somehow manages to throw crazy amounts of enemies and bullets around the screen, whilst moving as smooth as butter, and the audio clarity is fantastic to boot. Gameplay-wise, it's a fun outing, switching between run and gun stages on the ground and shmup levels in a ship, much like in Turrican 2. There are certainly some odd and noticeable missteps here and there in the level design, but even so the game remains one of the most exciting on the system, with many memorable set pieces. Troddlers is a likeable puzzle game from Sweden that's essentially like a cross between the puzzle classics Lemmings and Solomon's Key. In it you create blocks to navigate around the screen, and these blocks are also used to lead the little Troddlers to the exit before the time limit's up. It contains great art design and music, and even throws in a lot of extras and modes, including some cool 2-player modes for good measure. Now this is an odd one with a very unique concept. The game has you desperately trying to escape from a sinking ship before the time runs out, trying to bring along as many survivors as possible with you, with the survivors you save affecting the ending that you receive. Unfortunately for you though, the passengers of the doomed luxury liner happen to be some of the most stubborn, lazy and frankly suicidal group of people you'll ever meet. They'll fight you every step of the way as you try to rescue them, and even if you do convince them to follow you, they'll incessantly complain, constantly asking you if they can have a nice relaxing rest whilst you're still in the hull of a sinking ship. It's lucky they don't have any food with them, as they'd probably sit down and start a picnic every 5 minutes. The game uses the SNES rotation capabilities to recreate the rolling of the sinking ship, changing the environment as you make your way through it. Definitely one of the most memorable and replayable games of the time. Now this was a surprisingly good Turtles licensed fighting game. In fact, to be fair to them, the Turtles have actually been blessed with a number of good games over the years. Here with Turtles Tournament Fighters we have perhaps not the most original of releases for the genre, with it being very much patterned on Street Fighter 2, but it's a solid fighting game with a good amount of challenge and a great selection of characters that really represents the franchise excellently, and should absolutely please die-hard fans of the series to no end. NHL 94 has to be one of the most fondly remembered classic sports titles out there, and is definitely my pick as the defining ice hockey game of the generation. It's just simply a very fun game to play, and this particular edition was improved to be much more balanced than its forebears. The Super Nintendo is famous for its high quality library of big Japanese RPGs, but here we have a very nice Western RPG of the first person dungeon crawling variety from the popular Might and Magic series, ported to SNES mostly intact and with some nice graphical improvements too. As is often the case with these American RPGs, we have much more focus on stats, equipment and character creation here, as well as a more non-linear world where the player is much more free to do what they want, with a lot less focus on the story, narrative and character interaction that JRPGs are so known for. This third game in the series streamlined a lot of the gameplay mechanics to make everything more accessible and intuitive to learn, and there's even more to see and do than ever before. The game also supports the SNES mouse, which is an absolute must here if you want to have a smooth experience, as without it it's very clunky to navigate the menus. Here's another great arcade port that remains popular and sought after to this day. Deep down at its core, Sunset Riders is your typical run and gun game, very much patterned on the Contra series, but what we have here is a very polished representation of the genre with some nice variety and a memorable cowboy theme that is uncommon in run and gun games, which helps to differentiate the game a bit from some of its lesser brethren. It's a nice action-packed 2-player outing, though it is a little on the short side due to its arcade roots. Side note, avoid the Mega Drive version, it was jumbled up and hacked to pieces. I have to admit that this nice JRPG really flew under the radar for me for quite some time. I think it must be the box art, or maybe even the title itself, that just doesn't do a great job of selling the game or doing it justice, looking a bit staid and stuffy. But what we actually have here is a highly polished, colourful JRPG from the makers of Illusion of Gaia and ActRaiser, with a feel and personality of its own. As opposed to most JRPGs, you don't actually meet and enlist new friends to your party as the game goes on here. Your party is literally built by you out of parts, with each new robot you create being customisable. Some people even go as far as to say that it's almost like the missing link between traditional JRPGs and Pokemon, due to the way the player does no fighting of their own, instead throwing out orbs containing their fighters, with them attacking one after the other. Overall a memorable and fun take on the genre, though it's a little lightweight and linear, so it's perhaps better suited to the less hardcore of JRPG fans out there. With Goof Troop, Capcom really proved that they're not adverse to taking the odd chance with some of their Disney licenses, as instead of doing what you'd expect, i.e. making Goof Troop a polished platformer, they actually made a fun and colourful logic puzzle game here. Apart from the puzzle solving, there's a lot of action, and the two-player option is great to play through with a friend. Unfortunately, it is a little on the short side, but it's a lot of fun while it lasts. This is a fairly memorable Japanese strategy game from Namco, where you need to build bases, missile batteries and mechs to defend yourself and take out the opponent. The game exists in a sort of halfway house between real-time strategy and turn-based strategy, with the players improving their bases simultaneously most of the time, but taking turns during combat. The combat itself has an interesting feel to it, reminiscent of the board game Battleship, where players have to send rockets out to discern the layouts of their opponent's bases. It's an addictive game that SNES fans with an interest in strategy should definitely check out. Street Racer is an underrated Super Mario Kart clone which, believe it or not, manages to outdo its source material in a few areas. Firstly and most importantly, it has full screen display for single player, but secondly it actually sports a 4-player simultaneous split screen mode. Unfortunately the gameplay, while fun, isn't quite up to Mario Kart standard, but its extra features and game modes still help to make it a worthwhile purchase. This is a unique RPG which spans millions of years as you evolve your life form through different stages. Starting out as a lowly fish, attacking and eating the other sea creatures, you slowly level up and gain new appendages to your creature, eventually even evolving to become a land animal and such. It's a very strange and memorable experience that is unlike any other RPG on the system. This was simply a fantastic tennis game. Released by Nintendo in the West, Super Tennis got everything right, was highly polished and had a nice cartoony style for the graphics. The game was arguably the best representation of the sport on the market at the time, and it remains a lot of fun even now. After a rocky start with the first Final Fight, which had lost the all-important 2-player option and even one of the 3 playable characters, Capcom redeemed themselves with its third game in the series. A pretty late release for the system, Final Fight 3 hits all of the necessary brawler beats, including 2-player co-op and lots of thugs to wail on. The moveset especially is a highlight, with Capcom adding Street Fighter 2 style special moves into the mix, which makes for a much more dynamic game. All in all, a strong offering in the brawler genre for Super Nintendo. Another excellent Disney platformer, Magical Quest is a highly polished outing for the world's most famous cartoon mouse. As you'd expect from developers Capcom, it's a well-constructed game with phenomenal art design, including some really sumptuous environments. The main thing that makes the game stand out though, is its inclusion of a bunch of brilliant suits that Mickey can gain as the game progresses. Each suit gives him a new and interesting ability, and this constantly shakes up the gameplay so it never rests on its laurels and keeps showing the player new things as it progresses. As always, the ever-reliable Capcom strikes again. Was there ever a doubt? Here the Super Nintendo was blessed with an iteration of one of the Mega Drive's most popular series of action games, this being the unofficial third game in the Rocket Knight Adventure series. Confusingly enough, this actually uses the same name as the second title in the series, Sparkster for the Mega Drive, which was a completely different game. SNES Sparkster plays very much like the beloved first game in the series, but with much more emphasis on speed, action and set pieces. I wouldn't put it quite on par with said game due to it having a little less polish in the gameplay department, but it's an excellent game regardless, and it looks fantastic. UN Squadron was a scrolling shmup made by Capcom that was released in the arcades in 1989. It was based on a popular manga called Area 88, about a group of fighter pilots. The original game was a fairly standard shmup, but it was so well realised and polished that it was reasonably well received at the time. The title gained a new lease of life when ported to the SNES a couple of years later, with Capcom making a number of changes to the damage system, shops and planes in this version which make it a slightly deeper experience. The 2-player co-op of the original was however sadly absent. Kirby takes a change of pace here, starring in a crazy golf game. It's a fun and colourful outing for the pink blob that controls well and has the feel of the physics down well. The game is predictably also a joy to play in multiplayer with friends. Zombies Ate My Neighbours is another very fun top-down shmup, this time with a brilliant kitsch horror movie theme. The aim is to shoot the monsters and search the areas for survivors before it's too late and they get devoured. There's also some resource management in the game, with the player having to be careful not to waste weapons needlessly, giving it a slight survival horror meets arcade shooter feel. It's got a lot of style and there's a fun 2-player option too. This was a likeable European exclusive ported from the popular 16-bit computers. Cannon Fodder is a simplistic but fun action-focused strategy game where you control a team of troops who you can split up or send to commandeer vehicles and such. The game is just addictive, fast-paced fun, and thankfully this SNES port even supports the Super Nintendo mouse, which is very much the way the game should be played. This is a really fast and fun racing game from the company that would go on to make the global blockbuster Grand Theft Auto games. It's a side-view 2D game where you control a unicycle that speeds along the courses doing jumps and loop-de-loops. Pulling off tricks gives you a little speed boost when you land, whilst poor landings slow you down. It's a really unique and memorable game that's excellent to play against a friend on multiplayer. Now this one I know is going to be contentious. I hate to say it, but I think I have to place Contra 3 into my list of most overrated games of the whole era. Sure, it was a graphical powerhouse at the time of release, with some really exciting gameplay, but it's just so short. The whole game is around 20 minutes long, with only 6 stages in total, and 2 of those 6 stages, frankly, well, I'm just going to say it, they sucked. Let's be honest here, they were never anything more than novelty levels put there to show off the SNES's graphical features and little else. Still, in those moments when the game works, it really works, with some utterly untouchable set pieces. Set pieces that have you blasting down the road on a jet bike, for example, or riding around on missiles while shooting at an alien spacecraft. And also, I do have to mention here that there is an option to play it on a higher difficulty level, which actually adds some more moves to the boss's repertoire and such. So fortunately there is some replayability there for those who really want to master the game. Skyblazer is a very colourful, very fun action game with great level designs and lots of variety. The action-packed gameplay kind of feels like a mixture of Mega Man X and Ninja Gaiden, but with a stylish Arabian theme. It's full of memorable moments, has some awesome bosses, and there's a lot of very classy use of Mode 7 and other SNES graphical effects throughout. Perhaps a little on the easy side though, and there's the odd issue with hit detection here and there too. Think of your classic action-packed top-down shooter, and then replace all of the enemies with raging fire in a burning building, and you have a pretty good idea of what the fireman is all about. It's a very well put together, fun game with a lot of style, and the firefighting theme works perfectly with the gameplay. Unfortunately this is another one that Americans didn't get though, but don't feel too bad about it. We may have got the odd extra shooter or cutesy game over here in Europe, but when it came to turn-based RPGs on the SNES it was a wasteland here back in the day. After taking one look at Metal Warriors, most would understandably think they were looking at a Japanese mech shooter, possibly even a sequel to the excellent Cybernator. However, appearances can be deceiving as this is actually an American-made game heavily inspired by said Assault Suits Falcon series, which spawned both Cybernator on the SNES and Target Earth on the Mega Drive. Upon playing it, however, you start to see more Western-style game design, with non-linear environments and a mission-based structure. It's a good game with very good presentation and cutscenes. The inclusion of the ability to leave your mech and commandeer different ones with different features is the standout element of the game. It's a fun mechanic and brings some strategy to the experience too. So this is an important early real-time strategy game ported from computers, from an era when the subgenre was only just starting to find its feet. In the game you build up your forces of these little guys and get them to research new scientific breakthroughs to facilitate their conquering of numerous sets of islands over the span of centuries, with the technology evolving from one era to the next. It was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, real-time strategy games to use a tech tree, and one of the earliest strategy games to use one in general, coming out around the same time as Civilization and much before the genre-defining Command & Conquer and its predecessor Dune 2. Put simply, the tech tree is basically a system whereby certain things must be built or researched in order to give you access to the building or research of more advanced things later on. It was quite integral to later RTS games. Megalomania is therefore an interesting footnote in the genre, acting as a sort of primitive proto-Command & Conquer. Unfortunately the game was never released in the US on Super Nintendo, though the Genesis did get a version of the game under the title Tyrants Fight Through Time in that region. Block is a quirky platformer with a lot of charm that has you using your limbs to both attack with as projectiles and solve puzzles, being careful not to lose too many of them along the way, lest you be relegated to hopping around everywhere. The game is actually quite funny and inventive. I'll go out on a limb here and say it's almost certainly inspired by the popular British animation of the time, The Trapdoor, which had a similar feel. The music here is another tour de force from Tim Follin, and actually this is one of the main soundtracks which built his high reputation among gamers. It's phenomenal. Unfortunately there's a negative here though. Block is missing a save feature, which is a problem for a game this long, so it does drop a few placings there. The rumour was actually that Shigeru Miyamoto himself was quite taken with the game, and Nintendo were in talks to publish, providing a cartridge with battery-backed save, but the deal fell through in North America, resulting in it getting the saveless release that it did. Bearing in mind Miyamoto's experience with the game, it's possible that Block's art design may have influenced the textile and fabric textured backgrounds in games like Yoshi's Story and Kirby's Epic Yarn, which is pretty cool when you think about it. Lost Vikings is an interesting puzzle platformer where you control 3 different Vikings, each of which have different specialities. These Vikings have to be used in cooperation with each other in order to get them all out alive. Throughout the game the characters have their own little scraps of dialogue between each other that give the 3 of them a lot of personality. A clever game with a lot of character and some smart, well thought out puzzles. Often confused as a sequel to Secret of Mana, While similar in gameplay in some ways, Secret of Evermore is actually an unrelated game in the same action RPG genre that was also published by Square, but in this instance was developed by the US branch of the company. To an extent you can kind of tell this is the case, as whilst the game's art design looks quite Japanese, the game itself has much more of an American style plot, including Western cultural references and such. This isn't really a bad thing at all though, as it actually helps to give the game much more of a unique identity of its own. A fun take on the genre. Behind the cutesy exterior of Magical Poppin lies a fast and furious action game that controls and plays like a dream. The game is a platformer with some mild adventuring elements, including the attaining of new moves for the player as the game progresses, some of which, like the grappling hook, are a lot of fun to use, with you able to navigate through the levels with speed and style. Overall just a cute and very polished game, unfortunately import only though. For the SNES Ghouls and Ghosts, Capcom decided to design a completely new game in their well-loved series, this time not based on a previous coin-op. The result is a pretty good success to be honest. It's a very different game from previous titles in the series, as it's mostly focused on precision platform jumping using the new double jump move introduced here, and less of the twitch action elements from earlier titles. It's another brilliant SNES platformer, and the spooky art design is fantastic too. This Shadowrun game, created by Australia's #1 classic video game company, well, possibly Australia's only classic video game company, Melbourne House, aka Beam Software, provided a very different experience from the other 16-bit video games of the time that were based on the popular Shadowrun license. This one was actually a sort of action RPG game with point-and-click elements, which worked very well with the series' futuristic cyberpunkish feel. The plot and themes of the game are also very well developed, with the game being apparently based on one of the franchise's more popular novels, and it includes a rich, unique and memorable world to discover and lose yourself in. Easily one of the best non-Japanese console RPGs of the time. Konami's popular series of footy games were pretty much the only real competition for FIFA back in the late 16-bit era, and in fact this situation would carry on for much of the history of gaming. These ISS games on Super Nintendo were honestly some of the first truly smooth and intuitive games representing the sport, and while they may be lacking many of the features of modern games, they are still fairly easy to get into and play even now. Whilst the original Populous was one of the most important and influential strategy games of all time, I feel it was missing that certain something to fully flesh out the concept. Populous 2 fills that hole and provides a more rounded experience by giving the player access to a lot more spells and customization options. The game here also looks better, and even more importantly also includes some much needed mouse support that was absent from the original. This one is a somewhat odd import-only platformer with a strong puzzle element. Umihara's gameplay centres around the use of a grappling hook to navigate around the cleverly designed levels. There's a ton of exploration in the game as there are many different exits in the stages, which lead down different paths that the player needs to discover. This, coupled with a reasonably complex physics model with high skill ceiling for the swinging mechanics, makes the game especially well suited to speedrunning, and that's where much of its cult success and popularity lies. A very rewarding game to master. Personally, I feel that where it comes to the original, bona fide Mega Man, this is the one to go for on the SNES. It might just be me, but I always felt like Mega Man 7 was a step back in some ways and didn't quite live up to what I expected of a full 16-bit Mega Man title. This one on the other hand reworked and improved on many of the original series' elements, but also provided more features, including the ability to play as 2 very different characters, a more clever level select structure, and a much more interesting shop that actually provides more room for strategy. And word of warning, this particular section will cause minor amounts of trouble for English speakers without access to an FAQ. Outside of all the above, the soundtrack in the game is also phenomenal and very high fidelity. Flashback is a brilliant port of the Amiga Classic, which was among the most cinematic and memorable games of its time due to its strong atmosphere and fully fleshed out, fully realised gaming world that left most other game worlds of the time in its dust. The game sees you stuck on an alien world with amnesia, exploring the landscape and solving puzzles. It has a large moveset complemented by the game's absolutely fantastic and very fluid animation. The SNES had a bit of a reputation back in the day for struggling with the shoot-'em-up genre. Happily this criticism can't be levelled at the top-down variety though, as it has to have some of the best available for the time. Games like the 2 Pocky and Rocky offerings from the ever-excellent Natsume, which had some great art design and action that rarely missed a beat. This second game in the series also adds a few new elements to bring a little more strategy, such as alternate paths and choice of allies. The 2-player co-op however does suffer a little here, so if it's multiplayer action you're after, maybe stick to the original. Playing kinda like a more open, pastel-coloured Rocket Knight Adventures, Rainbow Bell Adventures, also from Konami, definitely stands as one of the best of the unknown gems of the SNES platformer library, featuring over-the-top cutesy graphics, a cool variety of power-ups taken from the Pop and Twinbee series, this is an offshoot of that series after all, and some nicely designed levels full of things to find that achieve you different endings. The game was unfortunately never released in the US though, which is probably why it's rarely talked about. Those wanting to import it would probably be best getting it from Japan, as the European version had some downgrades applied during localization. Initially, for example, the player could choose their own route, deciding which types of levels they wanted to play. This was omitted from the Euro version as it just forces you to do every level in sequence. And as opposed to the Japanese version, which provided multiple endings, unfortunately there's only one ending to see there. What we have here is an underrated puzzle platformer where you have a sort of mistreated servant that can be forced to wear a variety of humiliating costumes, each of which help you progress through the game. It's a smart title with first-rate art design, and whilst the game is a Japan-only release, it's actually fairly English-friendly for the most part. Sure, the story sections are pretty impenetrable, but the visual gags are universal, and outside of a few of the animal forms which are used just to progress past some dialogue in the game, it's all pretty self-explanatory all in all. Definitely something worth checking out on import. So this one is a member of the earlier mentioned Assault Suit series that had been such an inspiration to Metal Warriors. It's a very cool mech-themed action game with some exploration, with levels that are quite open that must be searched in order to find power-ups to improve your mech as the game progresses. The action is excellent, and this mixed with the power-up system is a great combination that makes for a more interesting experience than the average platformer. Due to the stringent censorship policy implemented by Nintendo of America, the Super Nintendo didn't provide that many proper horror experiences. In Japan, however, things were very different, with games like Clock Tower and this game, whose title roughly translates to King of Demons, representing the horror genre brilliantly on the system, and providing some of the creepiest video game experiences of the time. At its heart, the game is a platform shooter. It goes with a zoomed out perspective that does a great job of really highlighting the huge, grotesque monsters and environments of the game, and overall it's just a polished, action-packed title well worth checking out. This was the first in a series of excellent strategy RPGs from Quest Corporation. Strangely enough, the game's name is actually a combination of the names of two songs from the band Queen, which the designer was a big fan of. Ogre Battle is a pretty good game that contains a lot of interesting features, such as the way your character's alignment changes depending on how you play, as well as its incorporation of the passage of time between night and day. It's just yet another good RPG strengthening and helping to diversify the Super Nintendo's already phenomenal lineup. This is a really good, lesser known fighting game based on the popular mech series that was made by the ever excellent Natsume. Unfortunately only released in Japan, Gundam Endless Duel was definitely one of the better original fighters on the system. It's very polished, looks great, including some big impressive characters to play as with lots of moves to learn, and it runs fast too. Previously the developers made the respectable Power Rangers fighting game for Super Nintendo, which did gain a Western release, but this really takes it up a notch and is a much more polished game. This is the first game in the long-running and still quite popular Harvest Moon series of games. These are basically farming simulators. Now, I know that sounds pretty unappealing, but keep an open mind. The game essentially has you spending most of your time tending your farm, talking to locals, and most importantly attempting to get married and have children. It's honestly a lot more fun than it sounds, and it's packed to the gills with charm. This is a very nice action RPG, and along with its sort of spiritual predecessor, Soul Blazer, this one actually made it to Europe too, albeit with the changed name of Illusion of Time. As mentioned, it's an action RPG, and in this case there's a lot more focus on the action side than the RPG, with it being a fairly straightforward game. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Most of your time is spent whacking the enemies and solving the dungeon puzzles, so it's basically an action-adventure game but with experience points. All of the excellent cutscenes and likeable protagonists you'd expect from a JRPG are here, and there's even a possibly Ocarina of Time influencing gameplay mechanic here where you swap back and forth between adult and child to solve puzzles in the game, which is an interesting addition. Just a fun and likeable game through and through. Here's another fine outing for the insatiable little pink monster that consumes everything in its path. Kirby Superstar is definitely one of the fan favourite games in the series. It improved upon the core Kirby gameplay in a number of ways, and even included some crowd-pleasing and memorably over-the-top action scenes here and there too. The cartridge is actually a sort of compilation of new, short platforming adventures to play through, along with some pretty good minigames that are played for score. A unique and frankly quite odd decision, but it works pretty well here to be honest. The game is a little too easy for me personally, but that's kind of par for course where Kirby's concerned. After the success of the original Breath of Fire, Capcom managed to go one better with this excellent sequel, managing to iron out most of the wrinkles of the first game and provide a more engrossing experience than before. They improved on the already pretty good plotting and graphics, whilst tightening up on the gameplay and pacing too. One of the primary upgrades was to the battle system, which was a lot more interesting than before, but the addition of a new hometown that can be built up as the game goes on was also a very cool addition. A great RPG for anyone that wants a big meaty adventure. One of the most noteworthy and enduring of the tile matching puzzle games to come out of the era, Panelled Upon centres around you swapping neighbouring blocks around in an effort to match up three of a type. The game and its sequels were generally rebranded in the West so as to make them more commercially viable, with the SNES game renamed Tetris Attack and having Mario characters added to it, and its sequel appearing on the N64 made into a Pokemon themed game. This is yet another very highly polished platform game that never left Japan. This one's actually the sequel to the old NES game Milon's Secret Castle, but please don't hold that against it because this is considerably better. The game has some very nice art design throughout and oozes with charm. Gameplay wise there's not really anything that hasn't been done before, though you do have a secondary requirement to collect items hidden in the stages. But the thing is, it's all just so well designed and gets the platformer staple so right that most will be too caught up in the fun gameplay to hold that against it. X-Day is another brilliant scrolling shmup from Konami, this time a multi-directional shooter that swaps between vertically orientated stages and horizontal ones. It's a flashy game with a pretty good weapon system and some memorable graphic effects. That Ed 2 and 9 style boss is especially classy, and it's all enhanced by an epic sweeping soundtrack. Playing like an unholy love child of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct was a huge fighting game for developer Rare that played a major part in popularising combos in the genre. Now, combos had already been a big factor in fighting games, but previously they'd generally come about by chance, being unintended exploits discovered by players that had enhanced the experience, whilst in Killer Instinct they were brought to the forefront as part of the gameplay mechanics. It's an intense game of relentless punishing beatdowns, sudden reversals of fortune, and memorably bombastic and over-the-top announcers. By the time of the 90s, Konami's classic Gradius series was unfortunately starting to look a bit tired and was running low on ideas. Thankfully though we had the Parodius series, which was started as a parody of Gradius, to pick up that baton and run with it. And boy did it run with it. The series was absolutely packed with imagination and humour. It was full to the brim with memorable environments containing a ton of visual gags and some wacky offbeat bosses too. There were 3 Parodius releases on SNES, but this first one is my pick, primarily because for some reason it actually runs a lot more consistently on the system than the other Parodius and Gradius games on the Super Nintendo, which tended to struggle with inconsistent slowdown when the player reached full power. Still, all the Parodius games on SNES are probably worth checking out, and held the fort admirably until Gradius made its comeback with the excellent Gradius Gaiden. By far one of the premier arcade action games on the entire system, Wild Guns is kind of hard to describe unless you've played the old arcade game Cable. The game has you moving left and right and dodging incoming bullets whilst firing into the background with a cursor. It actually works pretty well when you've got the hang of it. The game is an exciting 2-player title full of balls to the wall action, set pieces, meaty explosions and last minute saves. Nintendo somehow actually managed to make flight sims fun for the mainstream gamer with this mission based classic. Pilot Wings was a launch title for the SNES in the West that did a great job of showing off the new Mode 7 features of the console. It's an interesting and varied experience with a lot of different objectives to play and experience that managed to establish the series and set the scene perfectly for the even better sequel on N64 just 6 years later. Puzzle Bobble, starring the characters from Taito's earlier popular series Bubble Bobble, represented a big departure for the characters, switching up the platforming, bubble-blowing action of the originals for a clever and unique puzzle game which arguably went on to overshadow its popular predecessors and became one of the most copied puzzlers out there, with numerous wannabe rip-offs turning up over the subsequent years. In the game you fire coloured bubbles up the screen to match them in freeze, and with precision you can drop a whole mess at once. One of the true enduring classic puzzle series. After a long hiatus, Donkey Kong finally returned in style with this phenomenal release. Nobody could have predicted the impact this game would have at the time, with it arguably almost single-handedly ending the stalemate between the SNES and Genesis in North America, for good. The digitised graphics really astonished people when the game was first shown, and the atmosphere and attention to detail for the time was pretty much second to none. And where the gameplay was concerned? Well, developers Rare did the most logical thing. They simply mixed the 2 preeminent platformers of the time together, with the hop and bop, 2-point health system and level design of Mario, married to the rolling, trailing second player and rotating catapults from Sonic, specifically Sonic CD in that particular case. It was a match made in heaven. This was a pretty nice version of the platforming classic that ended up becoming quite popular for the Mega Drive, so much so in fact that it even proceeded to get its own cartoon series. Earthworm Jim is full of zany, memorable characters, a ton of charm and some innovative level designs. It's actually a pretty funny game too, with the visual humour being aided in no small part to its superlative animation, easily some of the most fluid out there for the era. This SNES version also sports some new graphical effects, such as the excellent lens flare effect that would impress even JJ Abrams. It does however run in a lower resolution than its Mega Drive counterpart and has one fewer level too, which does have a slightly detrimental effect on the gameplay. After a slightly disappointing first outing on the system, Bomberman came back with a vengeance with Super Bomberman 2, a game that did a much better job at providing the fully formed battle mode experience that the series had become known for, with its plethora of maps and some nice modes like the Matango jump mode. The campaign has also been drastically improved, bringing the game more up to date with its TurboGrafx counterparts. Sadly, this one does not feature two-player co-op for the campaign though, unlike its SNES predecessor. So if co-op's your priority, you may be better off with one of the later Japan-only games. The original Lufia was a pretty good effort all in all, but just didn't quite do enough to separate itself from the pack. The developers must have really looked deeply into their first game and analysed its faults though, as this one, which was actually a prequel to the original game, pretty much lays to rest all of the original's issues. The story here was better than the already respectable original, and the gameplay was completely overhauled for the better too, incorporating a less random playstyle and a much more interesting puzzle-orientated stance for the dungeon sections, which almost play like Zelda dungeons but with random battles, experience points and equipment elements that are characteristic of JRPGs. The combination works well and it's a lot of fun. So this one is the third game in the underrated Gargoyles Quest series of games, themselves being an offshoot of the Ghosts and Goblins series. Demon's Crest goes more for an action-adventure style of level design, whereby you have to collect different abilities throughout the levels to progress, and this works fantastically, with the series' unique moveset of climbing, gliding and flying being improved as you go. The game has loads of depth and is thick with atmosphere throughout, but it's a little too short on levels in comparison to its main competitors, which caused it to drop a few places in my estimation. Hudson Soft's underrated answer to games like Tecmo's earlier Ninja Gaiden and Sega's Shinobi 3. Like said games, Hagane focuses on precision-based action gaming, giving you access to a sword and kunais as well as various acrobatic moves. The art design here is very high quality, going with a memorable mixture of traditional Japanese iconography with a futuristic dystopian steampunk design that works fantastically. Gameplay is fast and furious, quite fluid and contains a lot of tricky layouts and exciting set pieces. Simply a well-designed game that stands out from the crowd. So this is a really nice two-player game from the Goemon series from Konami, a series which was actually quite popular in Japan and got many iterations going all the way back to the original NES, but only a few of them made it to the West. This one, a couple of N64 games and a Game Boy game or two. It's a big shame as the series has always been made to a very high quality. This one has fantastic art design, great music, the gameplay is polished and has a lot of variety, swapping between tricky platforming sections, beat-em-up style sections and adventuring areas with shops and minigames to play and such. It's a decent length with lots to do and see, and the whole thing is just completely permeated by a ton of humour and charm. A very likeable game and underrated series in general. Now for me this has to be the greatest action game on the SNES, bar none, and serves as one of the most underrated games on the whole console. Super Turrican 2, which is made by the company that went on to create the Rogue Squadron series, is just impressive set piece after impressive set piece. The game doesn't miss a beat. It includes countless impressive graphical effects with a plethora of rotational and scaling effects, Mode 7 and even some large multi-jointed bosses a la Gunstar Heroes. The gameplay has lots of variety, going from platformer to into-the-screen spaceship sections to even Axelay style vertical scrolling levels, and the graphics and audio quality are some of the best on the system. Elements such as the grappling hook from the excellent Mega Turrican have been tightened up, and it's all a respectable length too. The game is excellent and certainly one that no adrenaline junkie should miss out on. In my opinion, this has to be the best vertical scrolling shooter on the system. Super Alesta, otherwise known as Space Megaforce in North America, has all the hallmarks of the classic Alesta series of which it is a part of, with lots of finely honed shooting action, memorable power-ups and exciting set pieces to blast through. But it also utilises the SNES's dedicated hardware features to provide a lot of quite cool graphical effects, with you swooping and sweeping across the terrain, giving it a very distinct atmosphere and graphical look. SNES shoot-em-up fans definitely need to make this one a priority. So this excellent puzzler is a rebranded version of the brilliant Puyo Puyo Puzzle Classic, just now with an added Kirby theme, much like how the game was rebranded as a Sonic the Hedgehog themed game, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Beam Machine, on the Mega Drive. The game, which has you competitively matching up coloured beans, retains all of the playability and looks great too. It is in a slightly lower resolution than the Mega Drive version, but that's a pretty negligible issue. After the less than stellar port of the first game, developers Sculptured Software managed to turn things around and completely redeem themselves with this brilliant sequel. Credit where it's due, the disparity is so large you'd think the game was running on a different console. This looks fantastic, it plays at a pretty good speed, it's reasonably accurate, well as accurate as home ports of fighting games got at the time at least, and it even now had the in-game blood and finishing moves from the arcade original that were infamously missing from the first game. Better yet, said arcade original was considerably better than its predecessor anyway, with much better designed gameplay to complement its more visceral, crowd-pleasing elements that the series had gained its fame for. This was a major release for the console, and one that helped to put its detractors' main criticism to rest. So here we have an excellent original iteration of the classic R-Type series, designed specifically from the ground up to take advantage of the SNES hardware features, with the system's ability to rotate and scale background elements on full display here. The game is tough as nails as always, has tons of action with little slowdown, and provides all of the intricate shooting action and difficult force pod strategies that the series became famous for. This sequel to the classic NES game carries on its high pedigree, with lots of memorable designs for the boxes and fun gameplay which revolves around learning each of your opponent's specific tells, and then coming up with tactics to avoid them and counter-attack. It's a nice game with a lot of charm, and it's one of the most accessible boxing titles out there, and it's one of the longest lasting sports game series as well, starting way back in 1984. Now this is a very unique and interesting game. What we have here is an attempt at marrying platforming with the sort of strategy sims that were starting to become popular around the time, like SimCity and Populous. The combination works surprisingly well, with it being very rewarding to actually get to fully see the lands that you free during the platforming sections grow and prosper with your guidance in the strategy sections. Both of the gameplay styles hold up pretty well on their own merits, with the platforming levels and boss designs being very well thought out, and the strategy elements having just enough to be interesting without bogging the largely action-focused game down. It all gels together admirably, and the soundtrack is a first-rate job throughout too. The classic series was brought into the new generation brilliantly with this ambitious retelling of the original NES game, which was renamed to Super Castlevania 4 and sold as a sequel in the West for some reason. Super Castlevania expanded on all of the prior gameplay elements of the series whilst also providing the player with a new, more versatile whip that could be used in all directions. This, I think, was one of the first times when you could really feel proper direction and art design in an action game, with the levels in Super Castlevania set up like movie scenes with their own carefully chosen and evocative soundtracks. The game is just a lot more cinematic than most games of the time, which makes it a very memorable and timeless experience even now. Nintendo's Earthbound was a uniquely offbeat offering from the JRPG genre that was quite unlike anything else that came out at the time, or to an extent even now frankly. Tonally and thematically it strays a mile from the dramatic fantasy-themed JRPGs of the time, instead going for a weird, quirky science fiction world of funny characters and aliens. A unique and memorable experience that plays with your expectations from the get-go all the way to the end. After years of incremental sequels for Mega Man, here we have the first really big change to the formula. And what a tour de force of a game it turned out to be. The setting was pushed forward 100 years, with Dr. Wily and Dr. Light long gone, and the Mega Man of old was replaced with the new, more agile X, long dormant in suspended animation. Gameplay-wise, everything has been overhauled, with a more exploration-based design with new power-ups littered throughout the stages to find, kind of like a halfway house between the Mega Man of old and Metroidvania-style games. The combo works excellently. Apart from the plethora of improvements here, the actual balance of the game feels great too. It's arguably the most accessible Mega Man game to date, and remains a joy to play through even after multiple completions. It's just so rewarding to get more and more efficient at powering up the character and blasting through those stages. Remember earlier when I complained about none of the Japanese RPGs being released in Europe? Well, strictly speaking this only really applied to the turn-based variety. When it came to action RPGs we got all the major ones and our very own Western release that didn't make it to the US, Terra Enigma, which so happened to be among the very best action RPGs of the generation. The game itself is the third of Quintet's action RPGs, following on from Soul Blazer and The Illusion of Gaia. It takes the best elements of both games and ends up playing somewhere in the middle. An underrated, ambitious title with brilliant art design and lots of charm. So what we have here is one of the most important strategy games ever made. Civ was one of the deepest games available at the time. And for this SNES release, the graphics were actually improved, making it a much more attractive game than before. There are some changes, such as the Zulus being replaced by the Japanese, and the whole game has been made a little more accessible too. For anyone unfamiliar with Civ, it's a turn-based strategy title where you send your little pilgrims around the map founding cities, which can supply you with better and better troops. You also partake in diplomacy with your enemies to form short-lived alliances, before ultimately betraying them every time. Definitely one of the most engrossing games on the SNES, and it even supports the mouse. Square did an unprecedented job of transferring the Mario series into RPG form here, fleshing out the world and characters to a level I don't think anyone could have foreseen at the time. I'd imagine many people probably thought that a Mario-themed RPG would make for a pretty limited RPG storyline, but their concerns would be unwarranted, as under Square's steady hand what we have here is a game that's full of charm and likeability, and even though Mario himself does little talking, his actions and manner are expressive enough to make him a fun protagonist. The gameplay as a whole is the usual RPG setup, though perhaps a little bit simplified, but it incorporates an isometric viewpoint and platforming elements that complement these aspects well. The simpler RPG elements make the game fantastic for those new to the genre, but even seasoned JRPG players will likely get a lot out of the game, due to the plot and exploration elements. This was another phenomenal launch title for the SNES, and another one that showed off what could be done with the system's dedicated graphics features. Using the machine's much touted Mode 7 abilities, F-Zero was able to run in a sort of pseudo 3D environment that worked considerably better than what was previously available for console racing games, affording a speed and fluidity not yet seen, and much richer and more complex courses to race through. And on top of that was some pretty memorable music too. Where it came to providing the feeling of speed and energy, F-Zero was simply unparalleled for the time, and it was, in fact, probably the best into-the-screen 16-bit racer in general until the release of Super Mario Kart a couple of years later. This is yet another JRPG on the Super Nintendo with a truly timeless feel and art design. This time it's an action RPG though, surprisingly the sequel to a 1991 Game Boy game that was known as Final Fantasy Legend in the US. An unconventional start to what would be a standout RPG series for the Super Nintendo, with this and its sadly Japan-only sequel, which was arguably even better than this one, but was uneligible for the list due to its import-unfriendly nature, being two of the greatest action RPGs of the entire generation. Secret of Mana is a game that has stunningly beautiful atmosphere and more than its fair share of charm, giving you fun transportation themes such as being fired out of a cannon and amusing characters too. Surprisingly, the game even has the totally unprecedented feature of including a free-player co-op for the entire campaign, making it one of the premier reasons to hunt down a multi-tap. Overall a must-play for fans of the genre, and in fact I'd say even those who generally hate RPGs may well love this one too. Mario and friends came back for their second mainland Super Nintendo game with this cool change of pace. The first thing you'll notice about Yoshi's Island is its unforgettable graphic style. Everything looks like a child's drawing made with felt pens or crayons. It's a very unique and distinct art style, and it looks great. Gameplay wise it's similar in level design to earlier Mario titles, but incorporates a new and interesting health system whereby every time you take a hit you lose baby Mario and have to rush to recollect him. I guess you could kind of compare it to the ring health system in Sonic games, but it's quite different in practice. This low penalty health system works quite well and lessens some of the frustration, though some of that is offset by Mario's incessant wailing perhaps, but I digress. The game is a bit more straightforward than Mario World was with its branching paths, which is personally the main reason why it's placed lower on the list. But make no mistake, this was an absolute masterpiece of a game, and anyone who hasn't checked it out is doing themselves a disservice. Squaresoft really went the extra mile with this first 16-bit endeavour for their Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy IV. Confusingly known as Final Fantasy II in the West, as it was renamed in North America due to the actual second and third Final Fantasy games never being released there. The game truly set the bar for all the JRPGs that followed, containing an epic plot that was large in scope and a really timeless score to drive the drama forwards. This was the first JRPG I can remember that contained an engaging plot and characters that drew the player in, and the world and art design envisioned by the developers now had the colourful SNES hardware to do that imagination justice and bring it into fruition. To me, this was where the Final Fantasy series truly started. Sure, the earlier NES games had been popular in their own way, but this was where the series found the formula that would bring it to the masses and uber stardom. Who would have thought that creating your own functioning city could be as much fun as this? It was an old title by the time it came out on the SNES, but SimCity was a game that contained a lot of depth and replayability at the time, and thankfully this SNES version is an almost full remake of the game, including much better graphics, some Mario Brothers themed extras, and a very welcome tutorial mode to get new players started. With the next gen consoles rapidly approaching and the N64 nowhere in sight, Nintendo needed something to try to show that the SNES could still throw a curveball and surprise the audience, and along with Donkey Kong Country, this was exactly what was needed. The game's cartridge included a support chip in it that was designed by British company Argonaut that upgraded the SNES to be able to handle 3D polygonal graphics. And whilst it looks pretty dated now, with a very low frame rate, at the time it was quite impressive. Technical achievements aside though, the all-important gameplay was still there in spades too, with the game providing the feeling of controlling a spaceship in Star Wars style battles. There's good variety and a lot of replayability with the different routes too. Without doubt the best beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo. Konami took their years of experience with the series and genre and honed what they'd learned to create one of the most highly polished, fast and fun beat 'em ups ever made. The moveset and general controls were excellent and responsive, with it being a blast to slam the enemies into the ground back and forth or throw them straight out of the screen. And the theme of the turtles travelling through time was a perfect fit for the game too, providing a ton of memorable environments and new character designs for the series, with the Pirate Bebop and Rocksteady being some of my favourites. Just a fun, accessible and timeless brawler for turtle fans, and everyone else for that matter to enjoy. The first Donkey Kong Country was a massive hit, so with the announcement of the sequel expectations were high. I'd say they were met. What we have here is a more polished and complete update of the original. There's some great new level designs and the music is somehow even better than before. The main upgrades are centred around the inclusion of tons more content and things to collect and achieve, lifting it up to be a much more rewarding game than before. The new character of Dixie, who has a unique glide move, also affords the player a little more choice than previously, as there's more differentiation between the two characters than before. It's a good addition. All in all, one of the most notable outings for the character and one with huge longevity. Super Mario Kart, the game that spawned a global blockbuster series that must be responsible for a million clutch wins and bitter family arguments over the decades. This first game in the series has to be one of the earliest into-the-screen racing games available for any home console, which provided a highly compulsive and competitive multiplayer experience. As with F-Zero, the Mode 7 SNES features worked perfectly to bring the courses to life, but the real masterstroke was in adding the RC Pro-Am style weapons to give an element of sneakiness and skullduggery to the proceedings, with the weapons causing players to pass back and forth in close races vying for first place. Easily one of the most exciting, fun and replayable 16-bit experiences out there. Here we predictably have another tour de force RPG from Squaresoft. Now this was just sheer epic storytelling at its finest. Final Fantasy VI's plot was some of the most engrossing, twisting and memorable of the RPG era, bar perhaps one which we'll get into in a minute. The game included what has to be some of the most fully fleshed out characters, and there were tons of them, all of which were given interesting backstories and clear, understandable motivations. The gameplay had a decent amount of strategy, giving you a lot of choice over what parties to form, the grinding had been decreased, and in general it just gave you a whole load of choice. Final Fantasy VI was just an immense game that was extremely ambitious in scope and packed with memorable set piece after another. Nintendo really had a challenge on their hands to try to better the superlative, era-defining Super Mario Bros. 3. What they came back with did not disappoint. Mario World had the same classic gameplay, but now with a lot more depth due to a focus around different exits, which opened up different paths on the main map, leading to a lot more exploration in the game. Other new additions included a nice minimalist art style, and most importantly, Yoshi, an anthropomorphic dinosaur, or dragon perhaps, that you could ride around on like a horse, or even betray to an early death down a pit to save yourself if you were feeling heartless. All in all, the game was just another timeless classic that made the Super Nintendo into a real contender even on launch day. Super Metroid represented a pretty hefty jump forwards over its predecessors, with a lot more care especially being put into enhancing the level design and lessening the frustration factor. Unlike the original NES game, which could be a little too cryptic for its own good at times, which to be fair was typical for the action-adventure games of the time, you can just tell this game was playtested to the nth degree to minimise these infuriating situations. The other huge addition here was an in-game map that kept track of your progress for you. It would become an integral part of all subsequent Metroidvania-style games. Of course, the expected improvements also came to the graphics and audio, but we also saw a fleshing out of the Metroid world, including more focus on cutscenes, action set pieces and the general plot. This was the upgrade Metroid needed to level up and enter into the big leagues. After much thought, I've decided to place Chrono Trigger above Final Fantasy VI as the best RPG on the SNES. Its sci-fi tale of time travel was just a perfect fit for the genre, spanning across so many memorable places and peoples as you jump back and forth through time. The game had a real sense of wonder as you explored its ever-changing landscapes, and everything was permeated by a joyous swashbuckling style that no other game came close to. Gameplay mechanics were clever and innovative, with the developers eschewing the usual random encounters for clearly displayed enemies, and other elements such as cooperative techniques were included too. The game was awesome, and all of this was hardly surprising really, given that this was worked on by many of the best in the Japanese RPG scene. and working with the very excellent artist Akira Toriyama no less, known worldwide for his immensely popular Dragon Ball series. The game which single-handedly rescued and repopularised the one-on-one fighting genre, with deep and most importantly fun gameplay as well as a large cast of interesting characters that caught the imagination. Street Fighter 2 took the gaming world by storm with its special moves and combos, with characters throwing fireballs at each other or delivering a brutal series of attacks and launching into the air with an uppercut. I was absolutely obsessed with this game when it came out, memorising all of the moves and practicing those Hadouken and Shoryukens till I had them down pat. More than any other game, I think this defined an entire genre of video games, with few fighting games straying particularly far from the excellent template laid down by this classic. This Turbo Edition adds some new features, playable characters and speeds everything up a little, enhancing the already great gameplay even further. And in the premier position we have A Link to the Past. Often ranked as one of, if not the greatest game in the already universally acclaimed series, the third Zelda game was a flagship early title for the SNES that built on the original classic in many ways, choosing to completely forget that the controversial second game had ever existed. The game excelled in all aspects, with big improvements to gameplay, graphics and audio. Dungeon designs were made more intricate and absorbing and were a joy to beat. There was a lot more time spent on plot and cutscenes to set the scene, and the adventure itself was massive. I feel like when I originally played it I thought I was coming to the end of the game, but it turned out I was less than 50% through or something. Even still, whilst long, it managed to be a fun and addictive experience from start to finish. Simply put, this was pure 16-bit perfection, distilled into a cartridge form. Well, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, then please like and subscribe, and maybe consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. See ya!